Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director at the Concord Museum. We have many former directors here as well, so we're very honored tonight. On behalf of the Board of Governors and staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 10th Annual Sally Lanagan Lecture with Jane Nylander, President Emerita of the Society of Preservation of New England Antiquities, now known as Historic New England, and author of the best ever, Parades of New England, 1788 to 1940, which you will be discussing this evening. The late Sally Lanagan was a valued member of the Concord Museum community for over 20 years. Sally devoted herself to bettering the museum, serving as the president of the Guild of Volunteers, member of our Board of Governors, key leader in the museum's garden tour and family trees display. When we told Sally's husband, Mike, about the topic of this year's lecture, he felt that Sally would have been delighted. Mike told me, this is in quotes, Sally was a very enthusiastic person, and once in Concord, I don't think she missed a parade. In fact, she helped facilitate placing our younger son, Tad, in one of Concord's parades as part of a group representing the Concord Library, I believe. The marvelous outcome was that Tad's picture ended up in the Boston Globe with their story on the parade. Tad achieved celebrity status in our early days in Concord through his participation in that parade, and of course, Sally's actions as his agent were a great assist. So Mike then emailed his son Tad for more details, and he shared the following. The parade to which my dad was referring was the 350th birthday of Concord back in 1985. I marched as part of the group from the Concord Public Library. The children's librarian who organized a group of children to march as their favorite book character kept a copy of the picture from the Globe article behind her desk until she recently retired when she passed it along to my dad. This was one of many parades we either attended or participated in through our many activities in Concord, including scouts, sport teams, and other community groups. My mother was certainly a frequenter of parades, regardless of whether or not she had a family member to cheer for. She always appreciated similar events that brought the community together in celebration. So we're deeply grateful for the continued support and commitment from the Lanagan family. Mike, along with his and Sally's sons, Sean and Ted, and their respective families are watching the program from home this evening, and I'm sure from their respective front rows. And thank you to the Lanagan family for their continued support of not only this lecture, but our wide series of public programs throughout the year. So our speaker tonight, this evening, is Jane Nylander. Jane is, as I said, President Emerita of SPNEA, Historic New England, former president of Strawberry Bank Museum, and former curator of textiles and senior curator at Old Sturbridge Village. She's an honorary trustee of Old Sturbridge Village, Historic Deerfield, the New Hampshire Historical Society, and the Decorative Arts Trust. She's very busy. Her many publications include our own Snug Fireside, Images of the New England Home, 1750 to 1860, Windows on the Past, Fabrics for Historic Buildings, and more than 100 articles. Mrs. Nylander was elected an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects in 2010 and to the Roll of Honor of the National Society of Colonial Dames in the state of New Hampshire in June 2006. She received the President's Award from Old Sturbridge Village in 2009 and the Iris Foundation Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Decorative Arts from the Bard Graduate Center for Studies in the Decorative Arts, Design, and Culture in 2005. With her husband, Richard Nylander, she shared the Award of Merit from the American Antiques Dealer Association in 2010 and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the New England chapter of the Victorian Society in 2005. So thank you, Jane, for sharing your latest research from the best ever Parades in New England, 1788 to 1940 with us this evening. And thank you to everyone who's joined us here at the museum tonight as well as virtually. And please join me in welcoming Jane Nylander. Thank you.
And thank you. And thank you all for coming to hear a little bit about my new book. It's an honor indeed, and I will say this is my second Sally Lanagan lecture, and I was studying look back through my files to see what I had spoken about before, and I discovered that actually I've given 4 lectures for this museum. The first in 1976, and I served on the advisory committee for at least 10 years, if not longer, with many good friends and curators from up and down the East Coast. And my husband and I have been guest curators of the recent exhibitions, the one on sleep and the one on shopping in Concord with the wonderful display of things from your great costume collection. So through all my years, I've watched as this wonderful institution has evolved from the Concord Antiquarian Society to this magnificent new museum, and I have to offer congratulations on that and say how much I'm looking forward to seeing it tomorrow morning. Also, my own interests evolved over time. You've heard where I've been and some of the things I've been doing. From a scholarly point of view, I've focused on textiles and interiors and historic clothing, formerly called costume. And I've watched the evolution of antiquarian collections in museum exhibitions and studied the beginnings of antiquarianism starting in my very first job in the early 1960s. But now in parades, and now in retirement, parades have become an absolutely fascinating subject. I decided I would get out and see what I could find about early representations of parades, what kind of pictures there might be before photography. And I scoured New England, local sources from one end to the other, digging in local historical societies and libraries, and began to focus on the floats, which I think are really a kind of folk art. I'm not really so interested in lines of hundreds of marching white men. They make an important contribution to their community and they make a statement about themselves. But I've really gotten very interested in the floats and how they define myth and memory, as well as reinforce identities and enhance loyalties. I began my research 14 years ago, and I really was spurred in one way by the very first float I find. Not really the first, but the oldest float that I have turned up anywhere. And it's been simmering in my mind probably for 30 years since I first saw it at the New Haven Colony Museum. This was pulled in New Haven for the ratification procession, celebrating the Constitution being signed by the state of Connecticut on July 4th in 1788. And in New Haven, it has been used in many, many, many parades to the point where when it was finally given to the museum, it was described as quite a familiar sight. But now they don't let it out, and so there are generations that don't realize that this float has been being used and symbolizing the ship of state on which all people work together for the success of whatever is going on. At the time, it was described as a federal ship with all sails flying, according to the idea conceived at Boston at their rejoicing last winter. And that just turn us back to Boston in 1788 in February, when the Massachusetts voted to ratify the Constitution. Less than 48 hours later, Massachusetts was the 6th state. A small committee of artisans and mechanics organized a lengthy procession in Boston. And unfortunately, there are no pictures. But you can imagine this, and I'm sure you won't have trouble. Stepping off at 11 o'clock on a frosty morning, when the ground was covered in snow, more than 1,500 men moved in occupational groups, with each group carrying a banner. Newspapers throughout the country published extensive descriptions trying to set a high bar for ratification processions that would happen later in every one of the 13 colonies. And a model for other future events. The line was led by 16 foresters with axes and scythes, symbolically clearing the land. Next, to underscore the idea that agriculture would be the foundation of a successful society, farming was personified by a man with a plow, followed by sowers strewing seed from baskets, reapers with sickles, mowers with scythes, haymakers with rakes, yokes of fat cattle, and husbandmen with hoes and spades and other farming utensils. There were 2 large ox-darn carts with elements of sustenance and raiment, the most important things other than housing in human life. The first cart was loaded with fresh cuts of beef and followed by 8 master butchers walking in clean white frocks. And the other carried flax dressers preparing linen fibers for spinning. And following them came 28 groups of tradesmen, each man carrying the tools of his trade decorated with ribbons. Shipbuilders exhibited a sled on which was a large workyard with 13 vessels under construction. And printers handed freshly printed messages to people along the route. The symbolic heart of it all in Boston, too, was the ship Federal Constitution, also on runners, drawn over the snow by 13 horses, another representation of the 13 states now united in a common purpose. So every little thing was thought through carefully to symbolize what this was all about. And when in 1789 George Washington was elected president, he realized he'd never been to New England, and he decided to, what else, take a foliage tour. He decided to visit New England in October and November, to a place he had never seen, to visit with the men with whom he'd served in military camps and in battle. He was escorted along the way by many mounted local dignitaries, and in many places expected to review a parade. And here in Boston, this arch was designed by Charles Bilfinch and built in front of the State House. And Washington climbed the stairs in the State House and stood on the balcony adjacent to the arch to watch a long parade. Again, following the pattern of the ratification procession, this time there were 50 groups of artisan tradesmen who got their act together in less than a week. But they're not walking with their tools. These groups had managed to each have a banner, a white silk flag, and they were with the name of their group, and they were all alphabetically arranged. There are two that have survived that I know of. This is the 12th, the cordwainers' arms. And cordwainers don't make rope. Many people have come to me and said, oh, they must make rope, thinking of cordage. But cordwainers make fine shoes, and the goat heads on this banner symbolize the kid, which they used for making very fine and expensive shoes. And the heraldic banner motif on the banner is based on the coat of arms of the London Cordwainers Company, and local men in Boston had full access to that and were well aware of the importance of it. Among the groups were the wallpaper makers, known as the paper stainers, and I'm particularly interested in their motto on their banner because it suggests something. People often ask us, did women have any role in choosing things for their households? And the paper stainers wished that the fair daughters of Columbia would deck their walls with American manufactures. So I think indeed the women did have that thing to do with it. Parades, of course, honor many different people. And one of the nation's most well-known and significant guests in the first 50 years was the Marquis de Lafayette, who had served with Washington during the war and came back in 1824 to tour sun scenes of battles and meet veterans with whom he had served and celebrate the 50th anniversary of the country. He brought his son, George Washington Lafayette, and his secretary, and they traveled throughout the East and then participated in the cornerstone laying of the Bomberco Monument. The banners that people carry in parades are important things, and they often depict very meaningful subject matter. But this one is really a hoax. It shows Lafayette at the completed Bunker Hill Monument, and unfortunately, Lafayette was long gone by the time the monument was actually finished in 1843. But he had been there at the cornerstone laying to hear Daniel Webster's oration and watch the participation of the various dignitaries in laying the cornerstone. The site on Bunker Hill was the scene of an annual parade that began in 1786, always on June 17th, and it continues to this day. And beginning in the mid-19th century, additional parades were held on that same day, and those continue too. An Antiques and Horribles parade, about which kind more a little bit later, and a doll carriage parade, which began in the 1930s and continues. What that has to do with Bunker Hill, I can't, or a gruesome battle, I really am unequipped to explain. When the monument was finished in 1843, there was another thrilling celebration, and of course a huge parade, mainly of soldiers, celebrating the completion. And throughout the 1820s and 30s, there was a series of sheet music covers that illustrate significant Boston landmarks, and they're usually for quick steps, which are marching steps for the militia, who, of course, to be looking snappy on parade day, had to practice frequently. And you see those sheet music covers showing soldiers in front of North Church and Old State House and Berry Street and so forth. Here's this one, the 76 Quick Step, is celebrating the completion of the monument, which was called a Grand Monumental Celebration. And I pulled out a couple of details here because the descriptions talk about the 108 survivors of the American battles in the Revolution. And here is a daguerreotype of George Fishley of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, aged 83 at that time, who went to Boston to be present in his Colonial War uniform. He had by that time been kind of a professional veteran reenactor who went to every event there was celebrating American Revolutionary veterans, and was fortunately photographed for us. And also the banners. The artist of this has made some of them clear, and you have some sense of the size of the crowd, said to be one of the largest ever witnessed in New England. On the banners, I can see the initials of the Oddfellows and of the Massachusetts Charitable Mechanics Society, the Light Infantry, the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company in their continental uniforms, who were among the 61 different military groups that marched in this parade. The streets were jammed with men. Women and children were in the windows and on the balconies. Some men were on rooftops. And they all gathered around Daniel Webster again as he gave this time a dedicatory address that was 1 hour and 56 minutes long, which many students studied carefully until recent times. Banners are important, let's see here, for any number of things: advocating a cause, or declaring a political opinion, or supporting candidates. And I have to say, I think this is my favorite political one of all, from the Boston Young Men's Whig Club in 1848, with a lawyer at the right and a carpenter with a square at the left where he could create the right angles for whatever he was building. They hold the Constitution and the laws and urge people to circulate the documents. Youth is the time for action. Let's have no abuse of power. This belongs to the Bostonian Society, now known as Revolutionary Spaces. And I must say, I urged them to turn it into banners and T-shirts and everything else this year, and they still have it in a box. They wouldn't even rephotograph it for my book. But it seems to me it's a message that ought to be quite vivid at the moment. But a lot of these banners are silk, and they're fragile, and they need to be cared for out of light and protected. These are 4 of a group of 17 that were painted in Portland, Maine in 1841 for the Maine Charitable Mechanics Association. And those remained in the hall of the association until there was an amazing auction in the 1960s. No, not the 1860s, later than that. Late 90s, I think. And a consortium of Maine museums bought them all, so they did not end up going to folk art collectors. They are still together currently in the Maine Historical Society for safekeeping. The images celebrate skills and products. The printing press, essential to democracy. And the ship advocates temperance, because and strong temperance movement in the 1840s when these were made, and there was an active motion to discontinue the Navy's practice of issuing grog to sailors twice a day. And the shipbuilders must have been fully in favor of that level of temperance, for they put this on their banner as well. The hatters with their beaver are also advocating temperance. And I was amazed to find, before photography, illustrations of huge parades on Boston Common. The Whig temperance, the Massachusetts Washingtonian Convention, the largest temperance demonstration held at that point, May 30th, 1844, with over 40,000 people showing up. The parade starts off with a band, as you can see, and the mayor in the carriage, as usually the dignitaries are near the front, and the marshals. And then you can begin to see the parade winding along with different military groups with their different hats and banners going forward. And you come along to something that is sort of straight down from the State House. I hope you notice that that is a float, the first I can show you from after the ship, and this is the old oaken bucket. A strong temperance song and poem based on something written by Samuel Woodworth in 1817 and set to music in 1826. And it becomes a standard float for any kind of temperance parade to have the old oaken bucket in it. I have pictures of them right up into the 20th century. And behind that, in silhouette, is a life raft with sailors celebrating with their arms in the air. They too are presumably celebrating the elimination of grog. And this parade was, as I said, among the finest seen in a long time. You'll hear that often. Everyone thought their parade was the finest seen in a long time. 4 years later, the temperance advocates gathered again in Boston on the Common as part of the water celebration, celebrating the arrival of piped water from Lake Cochituate in Framingham as a public water supply. And as part of the ceremony, they opened the spigot on the frog pond, and the fountain raised the water way up high in the center. Needless to say, there was a huge parade as part of this in October of 1848. And 11 temperance organizations from throughout Massachusetts came by train and marched in the parade. And the huge water arch over on the left on Tremont Street stretched between the Tremont Hotel and the Boston Museum. And coming through it was a large, full-rigged ship of war built in the Navy Yard, 26 feet long, and commanded by the master of the Franklin, which was then in the harbor. Additional floats in the parade are described, unfortunately not illustrated, but again, I'm going to ask you to imagine. One of Honeyman's superb fire engines borne on a car, which is the word for float, rolls of W.R. Tenney's carpeting, the Journeyman Tailors Society with Adam and Eve standing by a tree, the serpent twined around a trunk among the branches for a tailor. Isn't that wonderful? And the market men had something which drew out cheers by the roots, long, loud, and deep, a full-size stall such as they have at Faneuil Hall, borne on a car of suitable dimensions and filled with the choicest joints and cuts of beef, mutton, pork, lamb, poultry, etc., etc. Mr. Partridge, who was largely engaged in the manufacture of artificial flowers, had a rural car with 12 young girls dressed, of course, in white, exhibiting specimens of their tasteful manufacture and tossing them to the crowd. So some women, young women, are in the parade, usually dressed in white. Just 3 years later, I can show you the first illustration I've found of a full parade. Here's the Railroad Jubilee in Boston on September 19th, 1851. And again, the line of the whole parade. At first thing in the lower right-hand corner shows a group of policemen carrying a stick to clear the way so people will get pulled back so the full width of the parade can get through the street. And that's a good idea, as a matter of fact. And then the national dancers with their tall hats and the escort. The President Fillmore and Lord Elgin from Canada are there to celebrate the completion of the railroad link from Boston to Montreal, which was going to encourage shipping out of Boston's ice-free harbor and draw a great deal of Canadian business through to Boston merchants and shipping. And that was behind the whole thing. And then if you wind your way on up through the people to the third item up on the left, you'll see the great marble statue of the wounded Indian that has been at the Chrysler Museum in recent years, and then continue going in that way. Another man of war on wheels, the stuffed elephant from the Boston Museum, attended by melees on the shoulders of men in Oriental costume. A rare display from Silversmith, a miniature Mount Etna in partial eruption, a volcano, Quincy Market instead of Faneuil Hall this time, a full-size railroad steamship, pianos, a car from Hovey's Fireworks, you can see the initials for that, Honeyman's fire engine, an immense cannon or a peacemaker, and elegant specimens from stove makers and a boat club in their boat. And it wanders on and on and on through lines and lines and lines of various groups, and then ends up with about 3,000 children of the public schools in the distant blur there. But this is all quite clearly known because a book was published describing every single thing in it, and as well as all the other events associated with the Railroad Jubilee. A public dinner illustrates the street decorations, and the book was published within the year, 288 pages long, to describe this one great civic event, opening up Boston Harbor. But we can move to other kinds of things. The Federal Militia Act of 1791 and 2, as you probably know, required all white men ages 18 to 43 to participate in 2 military training days each year, providing their own uniforms and their own equipment. And those became festive occasions like the one on the screen. This is George Rope's painting of Salem Common on Militia Training Day in 1808. And you can see the action for the men is marching and drilling in the center of the common, and the rest of the community, women and children, are around the outside, patronizing various booths that have food, and then the men will be arriving because don't worry, there's plenty of alcohol available at this occasion as well. The people are happy to visit with their friends and neighbors and enjoy the day-long event. The militia companies were divided into 2 types. The elite companies, who had could afford expensive weapons and uniforms and enjoyed an elevated status in the community as well, as they do today. And here you see one example of an elite company, the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, which is the oldest in the country. In 1829, marching in front of the Tremont Hotel. They traveled together to events and were available for all sorts of civic ceremonies as they are. Those who couldn't afford the expense but still had to obey the law, ended up in what were called enrolled companies that wore old clothing for active drilling. They had various weapons or no weapons, and were renowned for their casual attitude and poor discipline after about 1820. After all, after the War of 1812, there was not much action to which they were called, and they were still required to show up and march. And they enjoyed the day, they enjoyed the alcohol, and the training days were characterized by great disarray. One at the bottom is 1828 in Boston. and above 1832 in a Boston almanac. As the training days disintegrated into drunken and disorderly chaos, a new tradition developed. And this is something that happened really throughout New England, not everywhere, but many places. Groups of men and boys began to appear as early as 5 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of July to entertain themselves and anybody else who turned out to watch. And clearly this was no surprise because people did turn out to watch. They came from large distance. At some points they even organized special trains to come to bring visitors to see the most elaborate of these parades. They tried to make as much noise as they possibly could. They dressed in antique military uniforms and scraps of ragged clothing. They were frequently masked, sometimes in blackface, sometimes dressed as women. They drove rickety old vehicles, or they limped along in great big shoes. The same features that were known in certain kinds of holiday traditions in England and on the European continent. And they first were known as fantastics, or the odds and ends, or the squizzleers, but soon as the horribles, and eventually as the antiques and horribles. I think the antiques comes because they're wearing their fathers' and grandfathers' old uniforms. They organize themselves into quasi-military groups, and I think this picture in Stoddard, New Hampshire in 1866, a 4th of July event, shows some of the typical get-ups. They're in a stable yard right near the village center. 3 of them are in military uniforms, and the band at left includes 1 young child. And it's really a ragtag, indistinct group of what on earth are they? They're wearing old clothes. One's wearing a hoop skirt. One has got a big belly but doesn't have a skirt, so it doesn't appear to me that it looks like pregnancy. I'm surprised that nobody's in a bloomer costume, because in the 1860s that would have been a common subject for satire. The couple with the baby in the carriage are all male, cross-dressed, and they are moving west, leaving New England and heading on. Often there were more specific targets: the police, the selectmen, pompous politicians, and all kinds of other people. In Charlestown, on Bunker Hill Day in 1875, when New England went all out to get ahead of the rest of the country and celebrate the earliest events of the Revolution, 1 full year before 1876, when the Centennial took everyone to Philadelphia. Imagine all these people traveling to Charlestown. Many came from Revere and Lynn and had to cross the Mystic River in order to be there by 5 a.m. Whether they came in costume or they arrived really early to change once they got there, I don't know. But the costumes are rather wonderful. In the tumbrel at the front, what does that mean? Marie Antoinette rode in a tumbrel to her death, but what it means here, I don't know. The marshal is carrying a huge sword of Bunker Hill. Those are all men, of course. Behind them comes a Calathumpian band with a dozen ophicleides. Their men are wearing, at least 6 of them are wearing aesthetic dress, those little pleated skirts and pointy-toed shoes like the characters in Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience. And behind them is a wagon labeled for the Woodhull's Free Lovers. Now, Victoria Woodhull was a candidate for president in 1872 for the Equal Rights Party, running on a platform of free love, pacifism, women's rights, and suffrage. She didn't win, but it was a grand thing to develop a satire about. And here, just 3 years later, this car is still remembering her effort to become the president. The crazy, discordant music of a Calathumpian band is pretty typical of a Horribles parade. This group is in Springfield, all of them masked, ragged and patched clothing, miscellaneous hats, miscellaneous instruments, from a muffled drum to a triangle, but who knows what they're trying to be. Some who masked left very quickly at the end of a parade to join the official procession or go home and change and then reappear on the podium later in the morning and read the Declaration of Independence. These were not all young kids. These were pillars of the community enjoyed this kind of fun and masking as well. And by the 1890s, you begin to have much more specific things in Horrible's parades, sometimes taking a hit, as they would have said, at a popular literature or general culture. Here at Andover, Massachusetts, in the 1930s, you have a group from Talmouth Avenue who are, I'll take that back, this is Haverhill, not Andover, but imitating the characters in Amos and Andy, which was a very popular radio show at the same time. And in Andover, they seem to have lost focus completely, and all I can say is that that's truly horrible. Some of these ideas are seen through the whole history of parades. And I'm interested in how things change. What are the key symbols and how do they change? Liberty starts off in the 1790s, sometimes looking like this with classical robes. This is a silk embroidery. But liberty has changed over time. And in 2013, I found this combination in New Haven on St. Patrick's Day. Obviously, with the radiant headdress that you don't see till after the arrival of the Statue of Liberty in 1886. But let's back up for another great symbolic float. This is Augusta, Maine, July 4th, 1865, right after the Civil War. This is called Our Country, its arts and its arms, national greatness and power. So start at the top with an eagle, which I assume is taxidermy. And the next down is an Indian princess, which has been an emblem of America since even early in the 18th century. Then come women in white and supporting Army, Navy, agriculture, commerce, and the laws. The wearing white symbolizing the purity, which was essential to secure the rights of citizens. And then at the base, 36 girls in white are representing the states. They each have a banner, a badge or sash across their chest with the name of a different state. They include Nevada, which was the newest state that came in during the Civil War, but interestingly to me, they include the 11 Confederate states. And this is just, as I said, 3 months after Appomattox. And to symbolize the reunification of the country, the girls have linked their arms as they sit at the base of this great thing. And imagine this, wobbling across that field on not pneumatic tires, but wooden wheels with iron rims, and then over the muddy streets of Augusta on a slope down to the Kennebec River. I can't imagine being up high. And indeed, there was a small child who was supposed to be up at the top with the Indian princess, and she has come down and is sitting in somebody else's lap for good reason, it seems to me. Anyway, the idea of having the states embodied by young women you see as early as 1800, again at Augusta. But to do that over time gets difficult because the number of states increases, and so you have more girls. And here at Thomas, Maine, with Liberty, look, not at all influenced by the Statue of Liberty. This is 1887. A few years after the statue had arrived, but she's looking quite different in a starry dress. But these are girls in white with banners, ribbons, pennants, I guess you'd call them this time, and matching caps. The number of states gets pretty awkward as you move upward. And some places decided to abandon that and just do the 13 colonies to make the same point. Here, as Newport, Rhode Island in 1916, a float produced by the DAR, Miss Liberty, not looking like any liberty we've seen before. It looks more like someone in a pilgrim outfit with her spinning wheel, which is, after all, the logo of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Narrative floats begin in the mid-century as well, telling a story. And you see here in the Centennial Parade at Danvers in 1851, Governor Endicott's descendants have gotten up in the attic and found old clothes and dressed in a tableau of sorts for this celebration. And tableaus usually come in chronological order. And therefore, early on, there's usually at least one, if not more, Native American scenes. This is titled 2 Centuries Ago, and it's a sort of domestic scene on one side, and the male hunters with their prey are on the left side. This is a drawing by a man named James Head, who was a bookseller in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who compiled over the course of the 1850s a volume of 93 different pictures of parade floats, some of which I can tell were built because they are described in the local newspaper, and some of which are so crazy and tall and they'd fall over. You know, they're just fantasies of his work. His book was never published, and it belongs to the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and it really is utterly delightful to look at, and I'll show you a few of his things. If a chronological series of floats didn't begin with Indians, it began with Columbus. And here is Head's not very imaginative view of the landing of Columbus. Men he described as being in Spanish costume, ready to carry us back to the days of great discovery. But this is pretty basic. But I know that it was in a parade at Portsmouth on July 4th, 1852, and in several other years thereafter. Controversy over who owns Columbus Day began even before 1892, when Benjamin Harrison declared it a federal holiday and urged schools to follow a curriculum that taught about Columbus and his importance as a founder of the country. And in 1892, at Worcester, Massachusetts, on October 12th, the Swedish-American community entered this Viking ship in the Columbus Day Parade, basically saying we were here first. And I've seen that in other places as well later on. If Mr. Head felt that Columbus's men should be dressed as Italians, as Spaniards, by 1920 and after, Italian communities began to claim to be the source of Columbus's support and staff. And so you begin to see the same kind of thing. Here, a version of the Santa Maria in 1935 in Connecticut, with the mast shortened tremendously so it could get under the electric wires, and presented by 3 different Italian-American societies. But they didn't bother with those gaudy Renaissance-style costumes that many floats had. Their men are wearing business suits and showing themselves as distinguished American citizens. But I think this is partly in response to reaction against the discrimination against Italians in the very early 20th century. Other chronological processions include founders. And of course, in New England, we're likely to see the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock fairly early in a parade procession. But interesting to me is that this one at North Bennington, Vermont, was done in 1907, not 1920. New England groups trying to get in on the attention to the founding of the country during the years of the Jamestown celebrations in Virginia in the same year. 13 years before the tercentenary. Other places honored their founders, and at Newburyport, a famous New England antiquarian, Glenn Tilly Morse, who was president of the local historical society, designed this float, and then dressed himself as the star of the whole thing, John Winthrop, bringing the Charter of Massachusetts to Salem in June of 1830. You'll notice he's carrying it in what in 1930 was called a Bible box. What else would you carry it in? To present to Governor John Endicott. And this is a local design of not elaborate, but I think adequate design, the kind of thing you see many, many times. Some of the depictions of land acquisition are popular in these parades, and I think one of the best is this one at Taunton for the 250th anniversary of the town in 1889. It was voted the most artistic float, but artistic was a thing in the 1880s. It shows a rich English woman named Elizabeth Pole who had come on the speedwell with money but was widely believed to have bought the land for Taunton in exchange for a peck of beans and a jackknife, which she traded with the Indians. And so here is stereotype number 99 in parades in terms of idea and dress and costume. The Western teepee, the war bonnets, Elizabeth in her pretty little Victorian white dress, sitting on a log, with her peck of beans. Parades reinforce this kind of thing by showing it to the whole community and showing it again and again and again. And you're not completely immune to this here in Concord either. This is Patriots' Day here in 1925. Again, depicting a 1635 scene, and I have to credit David Wood for helping me understand what was really going on here. The sign says, having purchased the land, this land from the Indians, I declare it should be called, I assume, Concord, not Concord. It's unity. Lemuel Shattuck describes this scene in his 1835 History of Concord and talks about the Native American people being involved. The float seems to indicate that the float designers had invited Native Americans to join them, and that who chose the blankets and the dark wigs with the braids hanging down, I really don't know. But it seemed as essential arrangement. The sign is imagined, but it's certainly memorable. And again, an example of local design and construction bringing together on a very important idea about the founding of the town, avoiding some of the stereotypes at any rate. Professional float designers got involved in many things, and here are a Boston float in 1930, the hanging of witches on Boston Common. Boston parade planners for the tercentenary turned to a New York firm of Messmore and Damon, who did Mardi Gras floats and laugh-in-the-dark creatures and parade floats as well, and produced this design for more myth and stereotype of the hanging of witches on Boston Common. I can't begin to tell you why the Halloween pumpkins and the witches' familiars of the black cats with their tails up are there, but this is what they thought, New York float designers thought would be appropriate. Often the tableau floats illustrate memorable Native events. Of course, Patriots' Day in Concord is shown by this again and again and again. Here on April 19th in 1925, in a snowstorm, as I understand often happens, you have this same kind of float. And sometimes the stereotypes are not local, they are national. The Spirit of 76, the fife and drummers, the big, larger images at Dedham in 76, and on the left is Concord, New Hampshire in 1930. Betsy Ross is a national symbol. And here in 1930s, you have a new design of a kind of float that completely conceals an automobile or a truck, and it actually seems to float. Earlier they called these things cars, not floats, but here it becomes a float. And also, Betsy is produced by commercial, every component of that is available for purchase through a commercial catalog. All the ruffled cellophane that covers the car, the greenery, the flowers, the arch at the back, the flag. You could even rent Betsy's dress if you really wanted to. And commercialization of float design changes a lot of things, and it's one reason I stopped my book in 1940, because I really wanted to be able to go on with the more creative and original sorts of things. Another popular stereotype in the 19th century is the log cabin as the basic home of the frontier family. You see it built for pilgrims in Plymouth in supposedly 1620. Here, this is in Elliott, Maine, nicely produced by the Grange in 1910. Said to be an authentic log cabin of the type used in that town, next to a pine tree in Maine. What else? The pine tree state, with supposedly handmade furniture and raccoon skins and dried apples hung on the outside of it, smoke coming out the chimney from a, quote, cheerful fireplace. But there's no sign of women's work. In the Elliott Parade, there was a completely separate float for women with a great big fireplace, needless to say, a spinning wheel, and a large cooking pots. But 50 years earlier, James Head had done designs for women's work as well. And I think these are fascinating. Here is Female Accomplishments of 1776. With a spinning wheel, you notice there's a sort of finial on the top of it. And you see the woman spinning in the middle, one at the right knitting, one at the left making braided rugs, which I have never found in colonial America, but came soon after the colonial period ended. But here are women being praised for productive, useful work, in contrast to the second one, which is Female Accomplishments of 1859, which is totally ornamental. One is drawing or painting, one is playing a piano, there's a vase of flowers on top of it, and then on the right one is having a French lesson. Totally frivolous and implied criticism of being less attentive to duty. Several generations, you find lots of floats showing the same idea, contrasting then and now with completely different symbols. In this case, this is the impact of electricity at Lynn. Where else would GE have built this great big float in 1929? The increase of women's leisure time and the diminution of physical labor. She is contrasted with a woman who's sitting at a spinning wheel in front of a great fireplace, and the 1929 woman is sitting with a stove, a refrigerator, a vacuum cleaner, and a toaster, and completely different activity suggested for her. But it's loaded with GE products, and it suggests one other theme in parades that continues to this time. And was a blessing, really, to parade organizers, because once it became popular to include large quantities of business floats, parade organizers didn't have to spend much time soliciting people to get into the parade. They didn't have to pay so much to fill the parade, and they felt that their parade would advertise their community as an up-and-coming successful place, and so they pushed for a big parade. And it leads you to enormous lines of stuff. Here in Danvers, the shoe begins on a small scale with a shoe shop, something that became the primary industry in Danvers. And these begin to replace marching men with their tools. Many businessman who had a fleet of delivery wagons could require his men to show out, drive them, and illustrate their products. This is Walter Corey, a furniture maker in Portland, Maine, in 1886 for a centennial forum. He entered 13 separate teams with all his workmen, not in work clothes, but in business suits, showing their best products and contrasting antique and modern furniture, as well as showing all their newest designs. And needless to say, the name of the firm is on the sides of every wagon and on banners carried by the men. And others used not so much their own products, but symbolic objects, like the great mortar and pestle, which instantly speaks of apothecary or medical business. Drugstore, this is Wilson's Pharmacy in Brunswick, Maine, in 1889. Advertising a changing business, which isn't just medicine, but now has fancy toilet articles and perfume and things that I'm sure in pretty packaging. And some businesses built special things that were more dramatic parade industries. This tricycle was built by the Boston Woven Hose and Rubber Company to be part of a Merchants Week bicycle parade in Concord, in New Hampshire. And you see it in front of the State House arch here. And the team that was assigned to run this thing took it to many parades for about 10 years within 100 miles of Boston. And they had no trouble getting it downhill, but they needed a large team and solicit local help to get it uphill as they moved through town. The point was that the tires lasted a long time. It's sort of like the L.L. Bean Boot or the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile today, just something big, dramatic, and eye-catching as the devil. Similarly, in Connecticut, for the 300th anniversary of Connecticut, the tercentenary, they had a parade with 300 floats for 300 years. And the Seth Thomas Company bought their famous mantle clock. You've heard me saying tercentenary or bicentennial or anniversary all along. Elder Wendell Holmes said after the 1876 centennial that the patron saint of Massachusetts is Saint Anniversary. Hardly a day in the year comes around which is not an occasion for some celebration of some stone in the temple of the Commonwealth. At the turn of the century, we get a completely different kind of parades. In the 1890s, in the White Mountain hotels, there are elaborate parades in the last week of August. The floats built by hotel guests who really didn't have much else to do at that time. It was getting cold, and the hotel owners wanted to make a big event that would encourage people to stay through the end of August. So they produced these things. And these influenced and really are the inspiration for the Flower Festival at Saratoga or Bar Harbor, or the Rose Parade. They come first up in the White Mountains. And both of these you see are in the same place, in the valley, the Saco River Valley, with Moat Mountain behind them. The upper one is Cleopatra's Barge, which was shipped by rail from Portland by the Casco Bay Steamship Company, trying to lure people to take a quick hours-long trade ride down to Portland if it was getting hot and take a water trip while they were in New England. And the lower one is the second prize winner in the parade of the same year, 1894. This was called an Empire Bridal Coach, decorated with 10,000 paper roses made by the hotel guests, and pink ribbons and silver tinsel. And if you can see the window in the stage, just above that is the top of the stagecoach, and then all the rest of that is built on top to enhance the idea of the purity of white and the excitement of the white horses and grooms all in white with silver. But this was tissue paper, and very quickly things changed because we suddenly then have crepe paper starting in 1892. And Denison Company in Framingham began making crepe paper right away and publicized it with a series of booklets, one shown here showing how to use crepe paper to decorate floats and automobiles and make costumes, and believe it or not, lampshades. And here in Portland, Maine in 1924, August, during Oaks, there was a doll carriage parade, and each of the three prize winners seen here received a doll. The first prize was the girl in the Japanese-style kimono with a big paper umbrella. her carriage is not decorated very much. The next one, the second prize, is the crepe paper roses completely covering the child and carriage. And at the right, the cutest is the third, who is standing behind her carriage, decorated, I assume, by her mother or her big sister or her aunt or her grandmother, and a design in this Denison Manufacturing instructional book about how to make a swan doll carriage. And she did a fairly good job, I think. In the year 1914 to 17, as war raged in Europe and involvement began to seem inevitable, preparedness became a major concern. And in Nantucket, there was concern about submarines. And this is 1916. Watch out. If you see one, you know what to do. Preparedness also was involved in other ways, and enlisting children to understand and be prepared for what might happen to them and to their families. Here's a group of kids done up with a Red Cross wagon, with the boys as doughboys and the girls as nurses, and they have dolls as patients as well. And Woodrow Wilson declared Flag Day in 1917 on June 14th and encouraged people to participate very widely and deeply and meaningfully in Flag Day, and sent posters like this one to schools and courthouses and public buildings all through the country with the statement, "Stand by the President. He wants you to celebrate Flag Day." And here in Massachusetts, in a town of Brookfield, in a little small village called Podunk, this group of people, I believe practically the whole school, has gotten into a float with Uncle Sam, and Columbia standing behind them, maybe a parent, maybe the teacher, maybe the oldest girl. They're all waving 48-star flags, and the girls are wearing starry crowns. A wonderful example of local design and strong feeling. After the war, wonderful celebrations, of course. Here's Columbia on a truck in Bath, Maine, Armistice Day, 1919. A full year later, there'd been time to organize a big parade, and they and everyone else went all out. A new official holiday celebrating the end of what was said to be the war to end all wars. We wish. And the next year, the Red Cross was honored in Portland by this flag of the mobilized humanity of the world. The nurse standing in her wartime uniform high on the float, and connected to her and to the Red Cross are women who served in different countries in the Red Cross during World War I, and each one wore a distinctive costume to show what country she had worked in, and during World War I, and they held ribbons that were tied to the Red Cross that united them in their activity and so forth. And at this time, there were more than 100 Red Cross units operating across Maine. In the 1930s, awareness of another war was rising. And at Bath Iron Works, the men were well aware of the munitions and armaments that they were building and ships that they were building in the factory. And I think they must have been relieved to be asked to make something for the parade in 1932. And you see dressing their boys in sailor suits, ominous. But these floats, I think, were considered a patriotic contribution by major industries. And I'm sure the workers relished the change and understood the meaning behind it. Patriotic symbols have come all through this, as you have seen. And something that I think is perhaps the most dramatic is the living flag, which develops in the 1890s. something popular in grandstands more at first than in parades, because it's hard to achieve much of an effect with a living flag in a parade unless you're on the second floor or in a church steeple. But here somebody had this wonderful photograph taken in Manchester, New Hampshire, in front of their beautiful Gothic City Hall, where 200 women of the worsted department of the huge Amoskeag Mills in Worcester, wearing red, white, or blue dresses and hats, marched over a very long route, and here they passed the City Hall. This was expected to be the best parade ever of that day, of Memorial Day in Manchester. Well, all of them are the best ever. And what I found again and again and again as I read about these in newspapers were phrases like, the finest ever seen here, a gratifying spectacle, and always the best ever. So I hope you'll agree with me that there are plenty of opportunities to be the best ever. And despite their ephemeral quality, they really are strongly influential. They define the community, and they convey the culture, and they illustrate shared ideas and expectations. They celebrate diverse identities, and they're included on marching units as well as floats. And the Horribles tradition, which seems to be primarily a New England thing, opens a place for the counterculture and for criticism, no matter whether they're marching at 5 in the morning or blending in with the official position. And always a good time was had by all. Thank you. Happy to take some questions if there are a few. We have time for a few.
And I'll ask that you ask the question in the microphone. So Jane, I grew up in Marblehead, and and we still have a Horribles parade in Marblehead. Have you ever been?
Not to Marblehead, no. Not for a Horribles parade.
So it's the 4th of July, and it is the children of the community for generations have organized, and there are often themes given for a particular year, and the parents get involved with the kids dressing up, but it's been going on for I don't know how many years.
Could be since the 1850s, I would guess.
And when I read your book, that was the first thing I thought about. We've always wondered why in Marblehead this existed.
The interesting thing to me is that the survival of these things tends to be going up the North Shore. They're in Nahant, they're in Revere, they're in Lynn, they're in Gloucester. Gloucester had a wonderful time with the teen pregnancy. They had a fine time with that. And they go right on up to, skipping some towns, all the way up to Machias. It's not so much in the western part of New England, and very seldom anywhere else in the country. I've seen references to a few in Hawaii in the 1860s with the missionaries. I've seen references to them in Union soldiers' camps during the Civil War, where they're taking pot shots at their leaders, the generals and the officials. So they tend to follow. Laurel Ulrich tells me that she has run into them in Utah, where the Mormons have settled, yet when I started learning about them, I began talking about them, saying, you won't believe this, because the descriptions in the newspapers are astonishing and detailed and long. And I was surprised to learn that many people had never heard of them at all, people who had lived in New England for a long time. Among them, amazingly, those of you who know New England museum history I will say, I told Abbott Cummings, the director of SPNEA, about this, and said, he said, I never heard of this. I can't believe it. It's not new. He grew up in South Hero, Vermont, on an island, and that may be why he didn't hear of it. But it's interesting to me that people will rise in the audience and say, oh yes, of course, we know Horribles, and just as often people will sit up and say, never heard of it, not in my town.
Yeah.
But
you should go see one.
Oh, I have seen them. Yeah.
Meaning the
Marblehead, okay. Yes,
We're really running short on time, but if there's one more question.
yeah. Well, thank you all.
Did you come across anything interesting in Concord's Patriots Day Parade in your research?
Did I come any interest?
Across anything interesting in Concord's Patriots Day Parade in your research?
Well,
I saw the one right
yeah, I had 3 from Concord. There's a wonderful collection of parade photographs at the Concord Public Library, and yes, there are plenty, and from July 4th as well as April 19th. There are broadsides at the library for Horribles parades in Concord. And they are descriptive of where you gather, what time, how to participate. They're very inclusive. I think it's interesting to me that they must have nailed these up on barns and fences so people knew the Horribles were coming. Sometimes the newspaper authors write about them as if they were a complete surprise. And yet clearly they're not, because there's always an audience. But people had great fun getting together night after night for weeks beforehand, preparing the costumes and getting ready, and lots of detail. Yep. Welcome.